Hello, good evening everyone, and welcome to Black, Radical and Proud. This event was brought to you by Black Conscious Coventry and the Belgrade. First of all, I just want to thank the Belgrade for partnering with a black organisation. We think it's very important that when black organisations have events on, then when it's in a public space, black people should have the courage to control. Black Conscious Coventry has been running for 2 years. The name of the game has always been the same. Run around organising these streets to turn their tweets into seats. And I think we've managed to do that tonight, so I want to thank everybody for coming out. We have managed to create a movement, allowing our community to have a voice. And we are humbled by the turnout yet again. I'm sitting here with two distinguished guests, Kehinde Andrews, Professor Kehinde Andrews, should I say, actually.
Right.
Congratulations on that. Author, activist, and Associate Professor for Black Studies. His research specialises in race and racism, drawing from his brand new book entitled Back to Black, Retelling Black Radicalism in the 21st Century. I believe he'll have his books on sale later on today. And we also have Esther Stanford-Xosei. She is an internationally acclaimed Pan-Africanist, reparationist, having charted new ground for interdisciplinary legal and history scholarship activist in theory research on Pan-Africanism, reparations for global justice. Esther will be sharing her experience with leader social movements and grassroots activism. Welcome. Okay, guys, thank you very much for coming here tonight. I just want to start with asking you about your journey. So can you tell us about your upbringing and the education that led you to this moment here? Which one is, Esther, do you want to start?
Wow. Upbringing. I was brought up by my parents. I actually lived on a council estate until I was 8. And so I consider myself still to be a working class girl in South London. Mm-hmm. My mother, South London, yeah. My mother is Guyanese, and my father was born in Barbados. He's now deceased. But education was the staple of our household. And I'm the only girl I've got 5 brothers. So in my family in particular, my mum pushed education down the throats of all of us, but me in particular, because she never wanted me to be dependent on anybody, and she wanted me to be able to have my own mind and to have my own say. So from a very small age, I was encouraged to read and sort of ask questions, which I did. And at age about 11, I decided I wanted to be a lawyer. And I knew I wanted to be a barrister. I didn't want to be a solicitor because I figured I wanted to be the best that I could be. And in terms of how I understood the conventional legal system at the time, I figured it would be better to be a barrister. And everything I did was with that in mind in terms of my education. So I went to sixth form, went to university, the University of Kent at Canterbury, and I studied law, did a law degree there, and it was a critical law school, so it was right down my street in terms of I've always been very political, very analytical, very, very aware, not only of my racial identity, but class, because I wanted to be a lawyer because I wanted to change the world at a very young age. And I figured law and education are 2 of the most powerful tools that you can use to bring about social change. And so, yeah, that's kind of my early education in terms of formal education. But on the path that I've chosen, that has chosen me as a reparationist, that path didn't start until a bit later. But I was always black conscious, as it were, in terms of my identity. Yeah. I did my first Black Studies course at age 16. And actually around the same time, I was so infused by my Black Studies course that at sixth form, I went to my form tutor, who was a white male, and I remember him dearly, because I've never actually had a black teacher in terms of formal education. Barry Jennings, and I said to him, I want to run a Black Studies course as part of the curriculum. And this was in the days of ILIA. And so what Mr. Jennings did, he went to the school authorities and they allowed me to run a Black Studies course as part of the curriculum in sixth form.
Wow.
Yeah? So that was actually historic because it had never been done. And so I called it was actually Black and Cultural Studies, and it wasn't just so-called black people that attended, because it was, you had the choice. You could either do religious education, humanities, or Black Studies. And so most people were bunking off anyway, so they chose to come to Black Studies. So I guess in that sense, I've always been a bit of a pioneer in terms of pushing the boundaries and trying to do things that haven't ever been done before. And not only did we get to run the course for a year, had to take a register and everything, we got some funding for the library. And so we chose some black books so that other students could benefit from it. So that was going on, but I didn't become a reparationist until I was in my 20s, my late 20s.
Esther. I'd like to ask the same question to you as well, Kehinde. What was your upbringing in education?
So I guess this is why it's really important to have politics with your kids, because I came up, my mum was part of the Commission for Racial Equality for 30 years. My dad was founder member of the Harambee organisation and the African Caribbean Self-Help Organisation in Handsworth, and both of those still exist actually, which is unfortunately rarer than it should be, right? And so we were always just around the politics, and not just around any politics, around the kind of more revolutionary, like Garvey, Malcolm, Massage Shakur, Claudia Jones. They were just people that I just knew growing up. I didn't know what they meant and who they were. I used to not volunteer. My dad used to make me go and work at the Harriet Tubman bookshop, which unfortunately has closed down. But that was a really important bookshop in Birmingham. So I just came up in there. And I say it's important, like, from an early age, because later on, like, most people who know me from high school would never have thought, like, when I took black stuff, I was the opposite. Like, you go through a phase where you don't like your dad, and you're rebelling. And, oh man, I would, like, you know the term coconut? That's real. I'll be real, man. I say I was there, like, because I was rebelling against all that black stuff. I was like, no, what's it black stuff? That's long in it. So, and it was only, and it was coming back to this politics when I picked up a book. And this is why books are really important. The book was called Stokely Speaks, From Black Power to Pan-Africanism. And I only picked it up, this is on my dad's book, mum and dad's bookshelf. I only picked it up because Stokely looks ridiculous. Like, the front cover, he's got his funny glasses, his funny hair, he's got a funny jacket on. I was like, nah, this book's going to be jokes. So that's why, honestly, that's why I picked it up. I'm joking, that's why I picked the book up. And the book changed my entire life, because it reconnected me to a politics which has always really been there, but obviously, like, as a kid, you just kind of rejecting stuff. Yeah. And that was when I was 16, and then from that, just completely changed. And then having that access to my parents' bookshelves, just reading all of the stuff and just reading all of it, and that just changed the way you think. And then from going on to university, that was it. Like, it was going to be, let's organise this, whether it's black studies, whether it's black students, whether it's black in the community. But without the early stuff, I don't know if that would happen. So that's why it's really important to kind of instill that with the kids.
What I like about what's happening here is that you're answering my questions before I ask them. So I guess this question is more for you then, Esther. Like, what were the influences? Who was influencing you, whether it was sort of personal or there was some political figures that were quite influential to bring that politics out of you at a very young age?
My biggest influence has been my mother, actually, because my mother, she hasn't been involved in sort of black organising in the way that I am, in terms of black autonomous organising even. But she was very active in terms of community development. My mother was a midwife. She's now retired. I have a disabled brother, so she was always involved in voluntary sector organising and campaigning for the rights of disabled people, people who were vulnerable. And so seeing her do that, she always used to take me along with her to meetings and things. So it just kind of inculcated in me this sense of mission and the need to serve and to give back and to help people, to use one's knowledge, one's positioning to try and help people in the community. And so for me, it was about helping. I was always very, as I said, black conscious. I don't know where that came from, to be quite honest, because my mum always, she taught me to be proud of who I am culturally, and I identify now as an African woman. But that aspect of my identity didn't necessarily come from my mother. And my dad, bless him, he was he was very, how can I put it? From Barbados, so he loved the Queen, and and he was kind of a bit different.
Yeah.
So I think he always saw me as a bit strange. And I remember when I first started doing my hair, when I first started having locks, and I used to wear a head wrap like Erykah Badu. And one day he looked at me and he said, "Why have you got your head wrapped like an African?" And I said to him, "Dad, because I am an African." And he said, "No, you're not." So that was an interesting conversation, because then I sort of had to question him about who he thought he was in terms of his identity. And it revealed, I think something quite tragic in that he didn't see himself as an African. Mm-hmm. And when I began to question him about our family history, he was like, "Well, we don't know. We were not encouraged to ask questions about our identity as young people, because in Barbados it was like everyone had a nickname and you just call people by these nicknames."
Yeah.
So when he'd be saying, "Oh, so-and-so," and I'd be saying, "Yeah, but what was their name?" He's like, "I don't know. We didn't ask those questions." Yeah. So yes, I always think back to who was it? Was there someone, an auntie or uncle? No, there wasn't. It was just something that was in me. And I have a strong sense of spirituality. I have a strong sense of mission, purpose. I believe that I was put on this earth to do the work that I'm doing. And that's the only way that I can explain what I'm doing, because it's ancestral. And I have a strong sense of my ancestry. And that this work around repair, in terms of reparations, was part of my destiny and part of the fulfillment of what our family's work has been.
Now, just following on from that, was there any... I want to get a sense of like the era that you guys grew up in. Like, what was the political climate at that time, and was there anybody that stood out that was like linking you to the way you felt at the time, that was like, yes, I can identify with that person?
Well, I know.
So like, I know for yourself, I know who you're going to say straight away.
That predictable? Really?
I know who you're going to say straight away. So maybe if we start with you first, like who politically inspired you when you were growing up? And tell us about the climate at the time that was.
Who do you think I'm going to say?
Well, having read your book and watched a lot of your lectures and things like that, I know that every fourth sentence has a Malcolm X quote in it. So,
yeah, of course, it's Malcolm, and I think like that's really important, because oftentimes when I say like Malcolm X, and it is beyond a doubt Malcolm X, and like Malcolm, he died 50 years ago. He lived in America, so it's a long way away. And everyone's like, well, isn't there nobody local? Isn't there nobody British? We're just asking this question wrong, man. Because the people who inspire you are the people who talk to you and the people who talk to your condition. Mm. And who talks to our condition, whether it be here, whether it be in America, whether it be in Somalia. I've had Somalian kids say they picked up the autobiography of Malcolm X in Somalia and read it, and were like, damn, that speaks to me. Mm. So for me, it has to be Malcolm. Malcolm cuts through a lot of this stuff, because Malcolm really gets it. And you should think, why is that? 50 years ago, thousands of miles, I'm in Handsworth, Birmingham, going to a school and we had a funny school, because it was a busing school in a sense. Mm. So it was a white area with skinheads around the school, lots of white people, but they bussed the kids from Handsworth into the school. And so it was like proper segregation of the dinner tables and all that stuff, like you'd expect. I guess you wouldn't expect, but like that's how it was, right? So And then reading Malcolm just let me understand why that was, in a way that nothing like locally or nothing, even my dad wouldn't explain it. And then when that hits you and when you see that, then you know it's the truth, right?
Can you just touch on the busted in? So when I was reading your book, you did mention it, something that was new to me. So can you talk about what, like, was that deliberate that they did that, bust in black kids from different areas, that they had to go to different schools? What was the purpose of that?
So our school was a bit strange in a sense. Like, so the school was used to be quite a good white school, like a good white school. It's a good white area. It's a good white school. And then, obviously, you got Handsworth is the ends, like that's where we live. And I think there was a purposeful attempt to say, let's try and take the kids, out of the inner city and boss them into this nicer area. That was a complete failure. I mean, total and utter failure. Because actually what it did, it reinforced the racial divide in a way that if it just gone to school in Handsworth, and I talked to people who've been to school in Handsworth, and they're like, well, we had white friends and black friends, and it wasn't that big a deal. Mm. But at my school, it was a massive deal. Like, your black kids stuck with the black kids, the white kids stuck with the white, the Asian kids stuck with the Asian kids. That's how it was. And that was very clearly boundaried and clearly marked. And actually, that's probably explains somehow how I think about things, right? Even though I said I probably went more with the white kids in that situation. Yeah. But understanding that process, understanding that works, and seeing how other people who I grew up with did afterwards, it's a different thing. But you could see it very, 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 very clearly. And again, someone like Malcolm just speaks to that experience in a way that I don't know anybody else who does. So.
Esther, was anybody?
What I would say for myself, I was also inspired by Malcolm X. I was inspired by Martin Luther King. I was inspired by Winnie Mandela. I was inspired by Nelson Mandela. And partly why I'm mentioning these figures is because these are the figures that I had access to in terms of information that was available about what they stood for, their writings, their thoughts. They were popularized in the black community. I can remember at age 13, we used to have a Young Black Writers Conference, ASA, Education Resource Centre in London. And so I entered this competition and I won for my age category. And I had written an article or a writing about apartheid, the struggle against apartheid, and my connection to the anti-apartheid struggle as I saw myself then, black woman who was born in the 70s and was influenced by that movement. And I knew I had this connection to Africa from a very young age. And that, for me, was the most tangible struggle that was very much alive. And many people around who I knew were politically active were involved in the anti-apartheid movement. Also having brothers, growing up in the 70s, being very aware of stop and search and how it impacted on my brothers, how it impacted on many of their friends who used to come around to our house, because our house was kind of like a community house, so everyone dropped in there. So those things helped to shape my sense of political awareness and knowing the distinctions in society. And I always wanted to do something to change that. And as I said, law was what spoke to me, because I was very aware of this notion that many people who were from our community were denied access to justice because of, not having the economic means, as well as, of course, criminal, the racialization that goes on in the criminal justice system. So that's part of what influenced my choice of wanting to do law as well.
So can you both talk about, like, what was stop and search like back in the 70s? And I noticed that the agenda of stop and search is coming back very highly on the mainstream now. So talk about then, and if that's a good policy to bring back now.
Stop and search never went. They never went nowhere. Stop and search, like, they had the SOS laws where they could literally take you into custody. I mean, that's a big difference with the SOS laws and stop and search. In SOS laws, they would take you into custody. Like, they'd put you in a van and take you to the prison, to the jail, to the police station. Whereas stop and search, they don't do that, right? They stop you on the street, they detain you for a bit. They may arrest you, but that's they have to have cause to arrest you. Whereas SOS laws, they didn't have that. They actually could arrest you. But the same basic thing is the same. But if you look at how we responded, and again, talking about Handsworth and the neighbourhoods are important there. I mean, the riots broke out 81, 85, and that's the context which, I was born in that period, but that history, that's still with us now. Like, we know that's what happened. We know that's how we responded to that, and we know that's what kind of the police-community relations had that still defines it. Because stop and search, even though you can't be actually taken in for no reason, well, you still can, but as easily, right? It's the same process. Right? They stop you, they take your time, and that's still going on. Just in many ways, just as badly as it was in the past.
Yeah, and actually, even before that era, I'm thinking much earlier, and I've recently lost my uncle. My maternal uncle was my mother's brother that came to England with her in 1959, and she was age 14 and he was age 15. And in fact, I officiated at his funeral, which was just last week. But I think very much about Uncle Roy, because Uncle Roy came here, and one of the songs that we played at his funeral was Many Rivers to Cross. And when I was thinking about the words of that, why we chose it, it's like he had that struggle too. And one of his struggles was against police brutality. Because in those times, my mum always said, they grew up in the East End of London, and she said it was very hard then, like in the late 50s, early 60s. That it was mainly a lot of our men who were here, but many of them were criminalised, were brutalised, were denied, obviously, opportunities. And that really marked him until the day that he died. Unfortunately, he ended up getting dementia and dying in a very frail way. But why I think about him is that in the 70s, he was thrown off a building by the police. And that did affect him, in terms of brain damage. He had many other experiences, and he was actually represented by a famous lawyer, Rudy Narayan, from Guyana, who took up a lot of the civil rights cases of our people at that time. So I'm thinking very much and remembering Uncle Roy, because this context has been there for our people, and it's really affected many families.
Yeah, and so after my dad was in the organisation, he went and became a criminal solicitor. So that's what he did for most of his career, doing legal aid work. And I've helped out with him, again, was forced to help out sometimes with my dad. And I swear, going to court, and then after we left school, the amount of people I've seen in court who I went to school with is mad. And I'm saying, this is mad. This is a conveyor belt of young black men who are coming in and out of the court. And a lot of this is for things which aren't really even crimes in many places, like possession of marijuana. You see how many people get caught up in it. So it's very easy to see what's happening to us. The police are the most obvious way of seeing what's happening to us, because it's just so disproportionate. And that's just that area, you just see it so easily.
How have your views on black activism affected your relationships with your friends, your family? And we had to put this question in because we've seen a little difference since we started getting into this. So we wanted to feel some people have been in a lot longer than us. How has it changed some of those relationships?
Oh, that's funny, man. Wait, I don't see none of my school friends no more. I mean, that's over. Let's finish that line.
Personal relationships that you may have had over the years?
I only have relationships with people who get the politics right. I mean, on a real level, I think that is true. You kind of make friends with people in the struggles and in the movements. And outside of that, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe you have a different experience?
No. No. Yeah, it does. It affects. For me, it affected my life drastically because I got involved with activism at a very high level in terms of reparations. I was involved with many of the leading movers and shakers in the reparations movement in the US, which at the time I got involved was what people were talking about. They were not talking about here, they were not talking about what was going on in the Caribbean. It was about America. And I became almost, fundamentalist when I first started out. You know this sense of when people become a born-again Christian, right? So, no disrespect to anybody, but it was like that. So and people were just kind of like, I'd be can you just stop talking about this issue? We just want to watch a film. And, so it began to be hard. And to be quite honest, I never really had a lot of friends anyway, because of the way in which I was brought up. My mum was very protective over me. You can imagine being an only girl in a very male-dominated environment, and young men come into the house. So she kept me with her all the time because she was very clear nothing was going to be happening to me. And she used to say to me, I'll be your friend, I'm your mom, your friend, everything. You don't need anybody else. So, I didn't keep many friends, but the few school friends that I have, I am still in touch with them, but we don't really socialise, and it's because my life has gone on a totally different path, and they're just doing regular stuff that I guess everyone does, but not involved in political organising, which does have particular consequences. Now, in terms of my family, I did have some attempts to try and divert me from the path that I'm on, especially from my parents, because they saw it as, why have we spent, especially my mother, why have I spent so much money on your education and you're wasting your time with all this black politics and organising? Because I went to bar school and my mum paid for that. It cost thousands. So they felt that I wasn't using my education in a way that they would have expected. And, part of it, I think, for some of our parents is they like to be able to say, oh, my daughter is this, my son is that. And so there was some attempts to put some squeezes on me by trying to deny me access to particular support, because it was like, you need to just go out and find a proper job and just do like what everyone else does and leave all this reparation stuff because you can't pay the bills with that. Because actually how I live is like an abolitionist. I don't really have an income. I've lost jobs because I've been involved with political organising. And when I say lost jobs, I've been constructively dismissed, including from black lawyers' organisations. So I have actually experienced quite a lot of repression and economic deprivation because I took particular principled stances around particular agendas that I didn't know were so heavy at the time. So that has had a huge impact on my family life. Now it's different because my family see where this is going and the mood and the climate. When I started out being an activist, I was seen as a very radical person. Many people from our own community didn't want to associate with me because they saw my politics as too strong, because I would bring reparations into everything. My paid work, I've always worked in the voluntary and community sector, and they saw it as, spoiling things, and, well, that's politics. We do that in maybe African Liberation Awareness Month or Black History Month, but when, all this stuff about trying to change the way we function in an organisation is not on. So that's had, a huge impact, I think.
What are the roles for Black Saturday schools? Are they important?
Yeah, so the Saturday school movement is hugely important in two ways. Like, one, that is our history. So, we don't really talk about history very much. We have a 50-year history of organising our own supplementary schools because the schools are so racist that they aren't teaching the kids, right? So there's a history there that we don't really know too much about. They're important also because, why do they exist? So all ethnic minority groups have supplementary schools, but they're usually about religion or about language or about culture. Our schools are about maths English, and then the history and the culture's there, but the actual main thing is the schools aren't teaching our kids. So they're an indictment of the schools. And we have to not forget that the schools are damaging to our children, right? So the Saturday school movement is important for that. I think going forward, what we found is that Saturday schools have kind of become part of what happens. So if you think 50 years ago, they were proper indictment. The schools are broken, they don't work for our kids, we have to do it ourselves. Even the more conservative people, black people, would say this is what happened. Now if you talk to people, it's kind of like the parents are the problem, the kids are broken, and this kind of schools are kind of getting off a little bit on this. And it's kind of become like a bit like after school or extended school. And I think the politics has kind of gone a bit. So I think they are important, but we need to remember why they were important. And they were really important because they were a political statement about the system of schooling. And I think that's lost, right? Our kids don't do badly because of us. Our kids do badly because the schools are unhealthy for our kids. And so how do we protect them from that? And that's why it's really important, because that's what Saturday schools did, right? They allowed many of our children to survive the horrors of the British school system. Like, talk to somebody like Akala, and he'll tell you, without Saturday school, there is no Akala. It's that simple. Because he'd have dropped out of school, wouldn't have done, etc., etc. So it's really important that we take the messages from the Saturday schools, which are the schools are harmful to our children, and we need to do something independent. And if we do that, then we'll be much, much better placed.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that Saturday schools are important, but I also feel, as Kehinde has said, that they are not necessarily doing now what they were set up to do in the beginning. And so I guess I have a kind of critical perspective on many of our Saturday schools, because they have just become many have just become about making sure our children pass particular exams, maths and English. They're no longer, and yes, they might be teaching history, but it's in a very disconnected way. So it's not really about how do you organically connect to your people's struggle that is a continuing struggle, and therefore we have to continue to make history. It's not about re-inculcating our people a sense of African pride and black self-determination in terms of building our community for ourselves. I don't think we're producing those outputs in the way that historically has happened. And so I believe we need to revisit what's going on in many of our Saturday schools in terms of what is their function today. And yeah, we just need to revisit that totally, because many of them are no longer, I think, performing the function that they were designed to perform. And a kind of very bureaucratic corporate approach to education has stepped in, and where many people are no longer in or no longer connect to a sense of a struggle or our people's, a movement for liberation, an African liberation movement in the way that perhaps was there in the 60s, 70s and 80s and perhaps to the early 90s.
But that is also why Saturday schools have declined. Yeah. Because they're not doing that. And that's what people want, right?
Yeah.
That is actually still what people want, but that's not there. If it's just come and do homework, I can do homework with a tutor, I can do homework at the school. So the Saturday school is just to provide that politics, which unfortunately many of them just don't anymore. And I think that's one of the main reasons they've declined in their support.
How has the public school system miseducated us, and what is like the damage of that?
That's like a big question. I mean, look, basically the school, there is a difference between education and schooling. Schooling is what we have in the school system. The purpose of it is to socialize you, to train you to be part of the system. Our system is built fundamentally and maintained on racism, and so therefore the school system is there to teach you into racism. Now, that's a short answer to say, obviously, the schools are therefore going to be damaging to black children, because one of the purposes, key functions of that school is to reproduce a system of racism in which puts us at the bottom. So the schools, just in their nature, have to be damaging to us. and that is through the curriculum, which you can see very, very clearly. Even when the schools start to want to change the curriculum, you still see this happens, right? So, for example, there's now a module, like an optional module, schools can pick on enslavement, African enslavement. Never had that when I was, when I was coming to school. That's like a complete fantasy. You never see that. So that, you could say it's progress, right? But I was at a event in London a couple of years ago, and a teacher was saying he went and visited schools, and he saw one of the displays that a school had done. This was like 14-year-olds. And they were doing about slavery, and they'd done a display, the pros and cons of slavery. I repeat, the pros and cons of slavery. One of the pros, and I do not lie, one of the pros was it gave the slaves discipline. Now imagine that. That's what they're teaching in the schools. Like, so, as much as things, even when the schools are trying to do something good, they just end up doing something worse than what it was before. So this is why we have to understand the school system cannot, and I include universities in this, it cannot provide an education for liberation. That's not the point of it. That's the opposite point of it. So that's why we have to provide that ourselves. That has to be part of our activism, is to provide whatever you want to call it, black education, African liberation, but you have the education for liberation will not be found in any of our schools by design.
Sure, I totally agree with that. And for me, what I would say is that when I think about my own personal education, I would say most of my sense of political awareness and certainly my identity, obviously I didn't get in mainstream education. I also, when I went to sixth form, found it hard to actually turn up to my classes. And I'm someone who was very responsive to being taught in those formal institutions. But I couldn't identify with the curriculum. It didn't teach me anything about who I am, who my people were, or anything that I was interested in. So that's why I wanted to do the Black Studies course, because at least then I could, as part of going into school or college, I could do something that I wanted to learn. So what the schools do is they kill a part of who we are, the menticide, the killing of our mind. And they are there to kind of train us to really be good Europeans. So those that are deemed to be the most successful in terms of getting good grades, it's because we've been able to master a curriculum that is mainly Eurocentric. And so I think we have to rethink what it is we're saying to our children when we're saying, oh, go, and it's good that you get these good grades, but for what? And if we look not only about what's happening here in Britain, but if we look at the kind of colonial education that our people have been receiving in the Caribbean and in Africa, then we wonder why we see the levels of underdevelopment that we do. And we have a bunch of bureaucrats, technocrats and elites, many of whom who have been miseducated, come to all these institutions, Oxford, Cambridge, the so-called best of them here, but yet they're not able to teach their own people about how to be self-determining, how to be self-sufficient. So we can see a direct correlation between the kind of education that we have been having and the continued underdevelopment that we are seeing even in the countries where many of our people were born.
Yeah, and it's worse, because that's the point, right? I mean, the worst thing anybody from the Caribbean or Africa or Asia can do is come to this country and study economics or international development. Because you are literally learning how to destroy your country's economy. That's the point of it. That's one of the main mechanisms of neo-colonialism. Yeah. You cannot take out the university. Mm-hmm. Universities are so evolved in the way this system perpetuates. Mm-hmm.
Right? I want to talk about activism. Like, how do we define black radicalism, and why is it so important?
Read the book, it will tell you. How do we define black radicalism? All right, very simply, there's two aspects to black radicalism. One is that it's black. And that sounds like it's like, okay, that's easy, but it's not, because that is in a far more political, not political blackness, but it's a political definition that says that the reason that blackness is important, that, you know, the color of our skin, the texture of our hair, is because it connects us to the diaspora. It connects us to Africa. It connects us to the Caribbean. Why that's radical is because it means that you can't have this national politics. Like, we can't be worried about how many black professors we have if we are thinking about the black nation. Because in the black nation, 3 million children die every year in Southeast Africa because they have no food or access to food, right? So it changes how your politics are, because you have to then build a politics around the wretched of the earth, us, our people, right, around the globe, which is really important, because think about most of our politics is based on how do we get access to the nation state that we live in. And that's just not the politics that we need. So that's one side of it. The second side of it is simply, I mean, to make it as simple as possible, there are two ways to basically look at the world. One of it is the racial inequality that we see, and hardly, I hope nobody in this room would doubt that there is racial inequality, and it is severe. Is that because the system is broken, there's something wrong with it, and if we do the right things, make the right reforms, we can fix it? Or is that because the system is doing exactly what it's supposed to do? And the fact that 3 million children die in Southeast Africa every year isn't an aberration. It is the logic of the system that we have. If you think that, you have to be a radical. Because radicalism is about overturning the political and economic system that kills our children. That's what black radicalism is. It's a global politics that says this system can no more provide freedom, justice, and equality for black people than a chicken can lay a duck egg. It's just not meant to do it. And that's a Malcolm X quote. I gave you one, right? I had to give you one. Right? So yeah, that basically, in a nutshell, is what black radicalism is. Why it's important is because we're getting mad. When we talk about progress, you're mad. You think there's progress? You think because I got professor, that's progress for you? I don't think so. That's good for me, but it didn't help you in any way. It definitely didn't help the 3 million children that die every year. And it hasn't helped the people who have to leave Ghana and Nigeria and cross the Sahara Desert, go through Libya, and then jump on boats across the... Like, the condition... In many ways, things are actually worse today than they were previously. And one of the ways they are worse is because we've forgotten that we're black. Like, we're starting to delude ourselves into believing that we are part of this system, that we are part of Britain, that we can have equality. And until we realize that that's not true, and that the only way for freedom for all of us is to end this and to build something else, we will continue to think about the symptoms of racism and not deal with the actual disease. That's why it's so important. That's why the book is called Back to Black. We have to go back to that revolutionary politics that says we're not settling for just trying to get the best we can. We are insisting that all of our people across the world must be free.
So for me, when I think about black radicalism, I think that black radicalism is true, it is global, and it must bring about systemic change so that we all benefit and not just a few. But I also feel that we must ground our struggle around black radicalism is a material struggle. It is about land, language, and culture. And we have to have a focus because it's true, you know, we can connect with global black humanity. But I feel the central focus of our struggle, and this is something that Malcolm also spoke about, in terms of we have to connect to our power base. And our power base is Africa, our motherland. So no matter where we live, it doesn't mean everyone physically has to leave Europe or wherever they're living and go back to Africa. Many people want to do that and have been doing that. But it's about knowing that we are satellite communities. We are extensions of our motherland. And so a lot of our strategic focus in terms of our activism, where we're directing our resources, I believe part of our disempowerment in the diaspora is because we are losing that connection to our motherland. Yeah. I mean, even the way that we're defined in the census when I was growing up in the 70s, we used to be referred to as Afro-Caribbean. Okay, we know that the Afro bit was meant to refer to Africa. But we knew it was symbolic of leading in that direction in terms of a homeland, a mother continent. And then now it's like you're either black African or you're black Caribbean or you're black British. So what we're seeing is like this dissipation of our energies because people are buying into these regions. But I know the centre of my focus has been always about reconnecting to Africa, even through my African-Caribbean family heritage that came through my parents. And that is one of the weaknesses of our movement. So even though we are identifying, many people are identifying as a black nation, but we are these satellite communities who are lost, who are lacking power. I think very much in terms of the context that I know best, Barbados and Guyana. And when you look at the situation of our people, they can never compete because what we have, say, in Guyana, where the population is sort of 50% African heritage, 50%, Indian, the Indo-Guyanese are linking back to India, a power base. They have a sense of being diasporas, but a lot of the African Guyanese are not linking back to their power base. So that is a huge weakness. And even we here in Britain, we can never, I think, find a sense of peace and recover a full sense or assert our full humanity if we are not linked to where our power is at, and that is our motherland. And why that's important today is because many of us are not wanting to identify with that, but yet we have European corporations stealing our resources. Reports being done by NGOs based in this country, like War on Want. There was one called Britain's New Colonialism, showing how 1 trillion worth of our key commodities are being extracted above the heads of our brothers and sisters on the continent, but that is also being extracted from us. Because we are the children of Africa. That is part of our inheritance. And yet we are in these lands where we're being squeezed, gentrification, being pushed out of areas, austerity, and so forth. So we have to connect to our power base. That's critical.
Now, both of you mentioned that there's... How do we really define activism nowadays? Has it gone backwards? Was it a time when we were more connected to the African and the diaspora? And how do we get back to that, if that was the case?
Well, definitely, radical politics has defined... activism difficult to define. What is activism? And I also, the label of activist and activism is sometimes something that we use to make ourselves feel better. Honestly, it is. And I've been involved in many different organizations. And a number of people are in it because that's the thing to do. It's like you feel like you're active, and as soon as it gets a little bit difficult, they're off. Because they were only ever really there to feel more comfortable about what they're doing. So I think defining what activism is difficult and it's slippy. I think if we say, can we say radical? I say definitely say radical politics is almost disappeared. I think that is one of the reasons for the book, is to say that, the idea that you could have an African revolution, our power base is powerless because literally people are just taking all the stuff out of it, literally stripping it out. And Sister Esther's right here, until you fix that problem, you can't fix any of the other problems, right? And the Pan-Africanism, the African Revolution, that was a real thing. When Malcolm talked about this 50 years ago, it didn't sound like some pie-in-the-sky thing. It was a serious thing. Now, because of state violence, largely, they just killed a lot of people to stop it and to really put the brakes on it. But the thing they really did, that really damaged the politics, was to bring us into the system. So think about 65, that's the first Race Relations Act in the UK. 62, you get independence in Jamaica and you get independence in Trinidad. America gets its Race Relations Acts in 64, 65. That's the key moment. Before then, we weren't in it. So when Garvey went around saying, let's go back to Africa, everybody's like, yeah, let's go back to Africa, obviously, right? But since then, they've brought us in it enough, given people like me good jobs enough, to make you think that you can get some kind, this is for you, right? And that, more than anything else, has declined our radical passion, right? Because now we weren't part of the system before. And now we have to be honest and say a number of us, all of us are, right? I get paid, even if you're on benefits, you're getting paid, you have a house. Your children aren't dying by the second because they can't have food, right? And I think we just got a little bit too comfortable. Even though we're discriminated against, don't get it twisted, we are discriminated against. But we are saved the worst oppression, which is for people outside. And I think we started to get a bit too comfortable, so that's why we've kind of gone after the radical thing. And that's the main thing that we need to do, is get back to that real radical argument that actually isn't about what we have here. It's about the whole system, and in particular, Africa.
Yes, and I think that extends as well to the politics that we've seen in the Caribbean. One of the differences between then and now, and how I would sort of basically define activism, is being about trying to bring about some kind of social change, transformative social, political, economic, cultural change. And so I definitely see myself and define myself as an activist, a reparations activist, a reparations scholar activist, in fact. But the difference I was saying between, say, maybe many of my peers now and previous generations and then younger generations that I'm seeing is that we're losing that connection to the radical politics of the countries that our parents or grandparents or great-grandparents, depending on your age, where they came from. We're losing that sense of connection. So with independence, so-called, in Africa and the Caribbean, the same thing that you've described has been happening here, where people felt that, well, we're included enough, this flag and anthem independence, well, we've got our own country now, so somehow we've got a degree of freedom, but yet neo-colonialism is running rampant. And that is a big part of the problem. So many of our people, even when we are still connecting with family members and whatever is going on in African and Caribbean countries, we're really connecting with elites. Yeah, we're hobnobbing with government officials and people who are also comfortable. So they're no longer fighting to kind of change the conditions for the masses of the population because they've been able to escape a bit of it, yeah? And that is the problem. We're not connecting with the everyday struggles of our people. And even though we are organically, because of remittances, and many people are still sending barrels home, or when you go to see your family, they're begging something, or they always want something, or whatever it is. So we are connecting organically, but that's not being turned into a revolutionary struggle. But to say, well, this is unsustainable. Actually, we need to sort of question, why is it that you can't afford school fees for your children and basic resources? Why is it we still have that brain drain from African and Caribbean nations? Why is it that our countries are still importing food that is basically killing us? And yet we have plenty of land that is just going to waste. And many of us no longer want to connect with that land because that is associated with slavery or something, and so we're not doing that anymore. Because that's kind of not backward, that's not being educated. So I think we have to radically rethink the way that we're organising. And so one of the things, I myself have been guilty of it in the past, and as I'm trying and striving to be a more conscientious activist, I'm making a purposeful effort to go and reconnect with struggles, at least in the countries that I know better and I have access to, and I also am a citizenship of, because that's one thing my parents made me do, or ensured that I did, take out citizenship in the Caribbean. So that is one of the things that I'm doing. I'm no longer just trying to, and I have hobnobbed, because I used to work at the Barbados High Commission, but I was always a bit of a rebel there because I was always challenging what was seen as the orthodoxies and the establishment, and so much so that I was threatened with the sack once by the High Commissioner because I was simply trying to fight for the employment rights of my fellow workers who were being paid next to nothing. And I was telling them, hold on a minute, you've got employment rights. And they were being told, well, no, we're dealing with Barbados law, not British law. So that oppression was still going on, even in the Barbados High Commission. So yeah, we have to keep connecting with our people. We have to go down to the ground. And I think this term, class suicide, is really important. So even if you think you have arrived somewhere or you have achieved something, you have to be able to identify with those that don't have. And that is something I've always done. Always had that sense of compassion and that connection to the people that haven't got, rather than looking at trying to associate with those that have and trying to be more like them or keep up with who.
What is the role of religion? And has it and how has it helped or hindered movements?
I'm going to give you, guess what? Another Malcolm X quote. But it's an important one, right? Like, Malcolm is a devout Muslim. And I could give you a whole lecture about the problem of Islam in Africa. But in some level, it's not that important, because I could give you a whole lecture about Christianity. But then I could point out to you Sam Sharp, Nat Turner, Harriet Tubman, Denmark-Vesey. Basically, all the slave rebellions were done by people who were Christian pastors, right? So on some level, there's bad stories on both sides, but we've also interpreted things differently. So I think that I'm just going to give you the Malcolm quote and leave it. Like, leave your religion at home, leave your religion between you and your God, because if we start talking about it, we're going to get into an argument, right? And we come together on a political thing. Whichever God you want to pray to, you go pray to them. But this is a political thing, and we can separate that out from whatever religion it is you need to have or want to have.
I agree with that, and I know that it can be a source of empowerment and emancipation, and it can also be a tool of oppression. So it's really how people wield it, but it's whatever works for those people. And it's true, when we look historically at many of those who played a role in our epic freedom struggle, you will find that they had some sense of spirituality. And however they chose to manifest that was however they chose to do it. So we cannot discount that. And I think that's one of the weaknesses or the separations that come in that don't need to be, because you will find people within organized religion who are also trying to engage in some kind of liberation theology, who might not be welcome or might not be embraced in particular circles in our community, because they're told, well, you're worshipping something that we should. But I don't think we should be doing that. We should recognize people who genuinely are trying to play their role, trying to make some contribution in the way that they can, and whatever motivates them, that's between them and whoever they believe in.
What has been the role of women in regards to activism? Why do we hear so little about them?
You want to start?
I mean, come on. Well, how did you all come into this earth? How did you get here physically for a woman, right? So women have always been there. We have contributed so much to our struggle. Going back from Africa, in the diaspora, and in all of our movements, you will find women. Of course, because part of colonization was also the imposition of forms of patriarchy that were very malevolent. And so there was a displacement of the role of women. And that was something that was a particular part of our colonial experience. Because what many of the Europeans wanted to do was they wanted to model our societies or the colonies on how it was for them. And so this kind of domestication agenda where women were meant to be sort of, in the house or something, that was not the case historically. And we know in Africa, women were commanding militaries, running economies, the markets, trade, not just sitting at home being domestic housewives. So we have to go into our history. And I guess in terms of nationalisms, because as a Pan-Africanist, one of the things that we've seen in particular within Pan-Africanism, within forms of black nationalism, is that we haven't been able to totally eradicate those negative forms of patriarchy within our movements. And so you will often hear a lot of the strong, what are seen as strong nationalist movements of the 20th century. The focus for the men was about, we need to rediscover kind of black manhood, reassert, put black men back in their place. And women suffered as a result of that. And because we knew what many of our men folk had also been through, there was always that pressure on women to kind of comply in solidarity with our brotherhood. But I think now we've moved into another century. We have to look back on the 20th century at what is seen as many of our great movements, and we have to repair those damages, those harms that have continued, and we can no longer allow this to continue as we move forward. And so in the reparations movement, which many of us refer to as the International Social Movement for African Reparations, we are very conscious of that. And you will find that many of the people who are doing the organising, who are doing the work, who are doing the foot soldiering, who are doing the networking, are women. But they're not necessarily the people who are standing up at the front in the meeting or being invited, or they're not writing books. There might not be public speaking. So there is a kind of invisibility of many of these women. But women have always been there and have been playing lead roles as thinkers, as strategists, as organisers, as developers, as community builders, as nation builders. Every single role our women have played and continue to play.
And I'd just add that we shouldn't write women out of these movements, because that's happened in a sense, right? So I've had people say, well, the Garvey movement, that's just patriarchy, da-da-da-da-da. Well, the Garvey movement had problems with patriarchy. But the Garvey movement was a 5 million member organization across 50 countries, and if you don't think women were involved in doing that, then you're mad, right? I mean, women are hugely important in the Garvey movement. Someone like Amy Jakes Garvey is actually probably more important than Marcus Garvey, particularly in terms of the dissemination. So who puts together the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey? It's Amy Jakes Garvey. Who writes some actually really interesting stuff about Garvey and Garveyism? Amy Jakes Garvey. We wouldn't even know that much about Garvey without Amy Jakes Garvey. So when we're looking back and saying we definitely need to work on the issues within these movements, but to throw them away as though there's some kind of patriarchal, that's crazy. Black Panther Party, same thing. Huge problems with misogyny, yet it was 60% female. 60%. Most of the work of the Black Panther Party is done by women. So you can't throw the movements away either. It's about saying, let's put the women back into the history. Let's say this politics is really important, and let's see, can we deal with the problems of patriarchy, which are huge within them as well. But I think there's been a tendency recently to just kind of wash your hands. We need something new. We need something new.
Okay, no. You're right. It's there, and there's some great historical work, historical recovery work that is being done by women historians in particular. People like Keisha Blaine. There's a really good book, Set the World on Fire, that talks about the role of women in nationalism, Pan-Africanism, black nationalism, and you'll be amazed at some of these stories or these herstories that need to be recovered. So I do think we need more, not only women, but we need more men doing this historical recovery work as well. That's really critical, because so much history is being lost, and it's not just about black nationalist movements or Pan-African movements, even histories of organising where we are, in our local communities, activists who were active 20, 30 years ago. A lot of that is just disappearing. So we need to be doing more historical recovery work, and not just historians or, all of us need to be engaged in that, because we're all carriers of archives, records, evidences that these people existed and that they engaged in particular work. And that's important not only for ourselves, but it's important for future generations, and especially the young ones coming up who are always asking, well, what have you done? Where's the evidence of what you've done? Which is also disappearing.
Let's talk about reparations now. What is reparations, and is that the key to unlocking this radical politics that you spoke about in your book? And how do we achieve reparations?
I'll defer to the reparationist.
Well, I'd actually like to hear what you have to say. Because I've read parts of your book, so let's hear what you have to say.
Is there going to be some tension here?
I think there'll be a discussion. I think there's going to be.
Yeah, so that's why I'm really keen to hear what you have to say.
Okay, so reparations, because I've had this discussion before, and I get criticized because I focus on the money and reparations, like the economic argument for reparations, which I think is a really important device to tell you why you need radical politics. So look, the reparations case, economically or in every way, other ways, is very, 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 very clear. We are owed a debt. I mean, slavery is unpaid labor for 300 years. There's a debt, clear debt, and you can also see how that money has been invested, has been used, has built what we have. So when people start talking about, oh, well, that was back in the day, should we pay the Romans? That's nonsense, because the Romans, that's done. We're talking about the same political and economic system. David Cameron is rich today because of the work that our family did, right? And we are descendants, and there's lots and lots of, there's legal cases of this where it makes sense, where you'd pay those reparations. Also reparations for harm, there's legal cases where that happens as well, right? Holocaust, etc. So I want to say that the moral case, the legal case is very, very, very clear. The problem with reparations, I think, at least in the economic sense, is that when you actually add up how much money this would be, I mean, in America alone, just for slavery, they reckon it's between $4.9 and $14.9 billion that we're talking about, right? So if you add that up for colonialism, add that up for Oz, add that up for France, add that money, come to a number. That number would literally, the money doesn't actually exist. It would destroy Western capitalism. Even if Western capitalism could survive by transferring that wealth to Africa, Asia, etc., that would in itself end capitalism, because capitalism depends on us being poor. That's, taking stuff out of Africa and having labor, right? So on an economic level, it's a perfect example of why you need to have something new. Because reparations in an economic sense simply are not possible. Like, you cannot do it, right? It's literally impossible. It would end the political system. So yeah, they're a great idea, but I guess my point is the system can't give it to us. It's not possible. And it should be used as a mechanism to tell us that we need to have a revolution. That's my take on it.
Okay, so you see, if I may interject here, so you're, from what I'm hearing, from what you're saying, you're juxtaposing reparations to revolution. Okay, is that I'm
just saying reparations. The argument is the perfect example of why you need a revolution.
Right. Okay.
Because this system can't give you reparations.
Do you not see revolution as being a part of a reparatory justice struggle?
Oh, yeah, no, definitely.
Sure.
Right. Yeah.
So what I would say in that, I mean, it's interesting that, I don't know, why is it that you focus on the economics more than any other aspect of reparations?
Well, I think because our oppression is in the political and economic system, and look, you could solve our oppression with reparations. Like, you give us the money, it's solve our problem, right? But it's not really possible. So I guess that's why the economics for me is really important.
Okay.
I'm not saying everything else isn't important. I just say, when I've talked about reparations, it's primarily been about the economic argument rather than the other arguments.
Okay. Well, I'll just share some of my perspectives on this. Reparations as a word, as a term, as a concept, is an ancient concept. Okay? I mean, going back to the Mandé Charter of 1222, African Charter, Mandinka Empire, we can see that we acknowledged reparations as a principle of law, of governance, of human rights, of people's rights, of group rights. So I approach reparations not just from the economic perspective. It's very important, but it's only one aspect of it. And I think part of the problem with people's overstanding of reparations is that they have very limited knowledge about what reparations truly are and what they have been, even for other groups that we often compare ourselves to. Part of the problem is the way in which we think about reparations. So it's often, when we reduce it to just money, we see it as something that someone else has that they have to give us, and we're passive. And of course, because we know that we are disempowered, then it seems kind of not realistic. Well, and you often hear, well, they're never going to give us the money. Now, in international law, which is what I deal with, reparations is not synonymous with compensation, which is what most people think reparations is. And a lot of the time when we talk about it, our thought process is still geared towards money. Reparations means to repair. And it actually, if we were to truly repair, and going back to the Oxford English Dictionary, the original root of reparer means that it brings about, whatever the process of repair, it includes restoration, it includes regeneration and renewal, and it brings about a transformation of the people or the group or the individual who is in search of reparation. So language matters, and from a cognitive perspective, how we relate to reparations matters. In the international social movement for African reparations, where we are organizing to effect and secure, and you'll very rarely hear me talk about receive and pay reparations. I choose language very consciously. To effect, to secure. That means that there's an action in it. It means we have to do something, okay? So in the movement, we use two definitions. We use a conceptual definition, and we use an operational definition. Now, the conceptual definition was put forward by Professor Chimwezu in 1993 at the first conference on reparations for African reparations for enslavement, colonization, and neo-colonization. And many of you will have heard the definition. He talks about repairs. Reparations, in our case, I mean, he goes, in his paper, he talks about what's happened to Native Americans and Jewish people and other groups who have received some form of redress, including compensation. And he points out that because of our unique experience of what many of us are now referring to in the Kiswahili term of maangamizi, meaning African Holocaust, because of our unique experience, we must tailor and fashion our reparations process and package to suit our own historical and, if you like, future requirements as an African nation. So he talks about economic repairs, political repairs, cultural repairs, spiritual repairs, technological repairs, repairs of every kind that we need in order to rebuild ourselves. He says more than any lands and to be recovered and any monies that we receive is the opportunity that the reparations campaign offers us, and he says as black people, for the rehabilitation of black people, by black people, for black people. Opportunities for the rehabilitation of our families, our cultures, our lost inheritance and everything, but he says first and foremost for the rehabilitation of our mind. Now, it's a very powerful idea around reparations, which, to be quite honest, when I first started out in the movement, working at a black lawyers' organisation, I didn't understand Chimwezu. It took me to be actively involved in the struggle to realise what he was talking about, the internal, because he talks about the most important aspect of our reparations is our self-repair. The change that it will bring about in who we are, our sense of ourselves, our sense of how we connect to each other, our place in the world, our destiny. So it is it's about a visionary process that must propel us back into being agents and masters of our destiny. That's the conceptual definition. And it's so brilliant that if you are into the economics, or if you're into culture, or if you're into health and healing, you can connect to the Chimwezu definition, and you can see the work that you're doing as contributing to that struggle. Now, operational definition is a more tangible framework that we can operationalize that conceptual approach to reparations, or reparatory justice, as I prefer to say, because when we think about, if we use the term reparatory justice, it's hard to just reduce that to compensation or money, because you can't just say justice is about money, yeah? So there is a difference between reparations and reparatory justice. They are connected, but the main difference is that you can enforce a reparations program or secure it or get it or be given it that can end up creating further injustice. Yes? But with reparatory justice, it really is about global justice. It is about a justice that doesn't take away from in order to be. So the operational framework is the international law framework on a right to a remedy and reparations for serious violations of international human rights and humanitarian rights. It was codified in 2005, and this is a UN framework, but when people hear UN, please don't think that people in the UN sat down and just wrote this document. This framework has come about as it's a consensus document. So it has evolved as a result of struggle and resistance and people stretching and, the law and policy and actually social and political liberation struggles to bring about standards that people consider to be the standards that we who are meant to be civilized human beings can abide by and live by. So under international law, there are 5 key aspects to reparations, and not one of them is no important than the other. And that a true reparations process must incorporate aspects of all of these 5 principles or framework or strands, I should say. The first being restitution. Restitution. To put a people or a group back in a position that they would have been in but for. So in our case, but for chattel enslavement, but for colonization, but for neo-colonization, but for genocide, but for all the war crimes, but for all the crimes against humanity, but for anti-black racism, including its specific manifestations of Afrophobia. Who would we have been if we had never been taken out of Africa? If we had never been, our power base been disrupted? If our histories, our herstories, not been interrupted? Who would we have been if we had access to all the wealth and resources that we have amassed, and we, the collective we, us, our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, our foreparents, our ancestors? And restitution includes tangible measures like a restoration of citizenship. So this long-held call, the Back to Africa movements, this wanting to belong, to be recognised, a right, and how some of us today have shaped it into a right that we are calling a right to Africa. We have a right to Africa. And in this international decade of people of African descent, we have organisations like the Europe-wide NGO Consultative Council for African Reparations that is advocating that Africans in the diaspora have a right to belong to Africa, have a right to benefit from the resources of Africa. We have a right to that. But that's part of our inheritance. It includes restitution of property, of lands, our rights, in terms of human beings, and a whole lot of other things. Then we have compensation, which most people think about when they think about reparations. But compensation is not just strictly about money. It's really about putting an economic value on harm. The harms of the past, the harms of the present, but also the harms that we know are being projected into the future. So when we think about the Niger Delta and the despoilation of that region because of the extractivism that's going on with oil companies, British, European oil companies, where they have said that it will take 30 plus years to clean up those lands. And if you think about where many of our people are agrarian communities, they're relying on fishing, they're relying on these to basically survive. That is part of the genocide. So we can already say the damage that's being done, not only for ourselves, but for the next generation or two. And you can put an economic value on that. The damage in terms of, or an economic value in terms of our harms, the loss of our harms to our reputation, so that no matter who we are, wherever we go in the world, people will have a perception of our intelligence, of our sense of worth, our beauty, what we're capable of, just by the way that we look and who they perceive us to be. That is a reputational harm. When we think about, what has been going on in terms of workplace, which most people who are employed, I'm sure would have had some experience of discrimination. Racial or sex-based discrimination, multiple forms of discrimination, where you know that you are training people who end up getting paid more than you. Many people are public sector workers losing their jobs, having given so much in service of this country. We can put an economic value on that. Mental health. We can put an economic value on the harm that is being done in terms of our displacement and our psychological dis-ease. So that's compensation, okay? It also is about the big picture stuff in terms of how African Caribbean nations trade and trade injustice. So the cost in terms of how our nations get squeezed and the way these economic partnership agreements that get forced on African, Caribbean and Pacific nations, that is all around compensation, okay? Then we can talk about rehabilitation. Rehabilitation, very, very important, because although it doesn't have a legal definition, just think about that word, what you think of when you think of to rehabilitate, to restore, to rebuild, to reconnect. So in our family, a lot of people in our community, our extended family, a lot of people who are concerned with health, with community development, with the breakdown that's been going on in our interpersonal relationships, in our families, the alienation between youth and elders. This is all about rehabilitation. Many of us will know that there's all this talk about community cohesion, but what about our own internal community cohesion? We need to be cohesive with each other first, right? In terms of the global black nation or the Pan-African nation. So that is rehabilitation. So it involves a range of measures, including social, psychological, therapeutic interventions, access to justice, access to the family support services that we need, the family building, supporting those lone parents, all those children who are in local authority care homes and what's happening to them. It's really about how we tackle that institutionally. What would be the measures that we put in place to stop some of those continuing harms? Then there is satisfaction. And satisfaction is really measures that we put in place to feel that there is some level of satisfaction and acknowledgement around redress. So there's an acknowledgement that we've been wrong. So for some people, that's an apology. It's about rewriting national histories, rewriting curriculums. It could be memorial days. It could be monuments. It could be very physical, tangible ways in which there is a wider recognition in the society, not just in our Saturday schools and in our homes, but across that society, that these people went through among the Mezi, that they are owed, that they are not scroungers, that they have a right to their resources, okay? That they shouldn't necessarily be turned away in terms of immigration in the way that many of our people are now saying, oh, there's too many foreigners coming here, and don't realize that we are that foreigner, yeah? Because we have become someone else. Then finally, we're talking reparations now, and I did say that most people have very limited knowledge and true education about it, and that's the problem. Because all of this, the last one, the most important, guarantees of non-repetition and cessation of violations, meaning all the racism today has to stop. That's before we can even repair. You can't repair something that is still happening. You have to stop the ongoing violations today. Then we can think about how do we rebuild, how do we reconstruct. Yeah? Now, the guarantees of non-repetition, it's really about how do we, like Jewish people, say, never again. Never again will we experience our children, generations to come, a Ma'angamizi. Never again. And we're not there. And in our struggle, what really troubles me is that a lot of our people focus on compensation in a reformist way, but they don't talk about the guarantees of non-repetition. So we end up being complicit or end up replicating some of the same harms because we do not think about that systemic approach to reparations or reparatory justice. Now, for us in PARCO, the coalition that I represent, that guarantee of non-repetition, a means to an end, not the end itself, is the re-establishment of a Pan-African nation. And we have referred to it as Ma'at Ubuntu Man. And Ma'at Ubuntu Man is a state, a super state that incorporates her diaspora, not how the sixth region of the African Union, where they're still struggling to recognize us. It is an African state based on African philosophical ideals around democracy and Ma'at as an ethical ideal. And also Ubuntu, because it's not just about us as Africans, it's about how do we relate to other members of the human family? How do we rehumanize the world? So our reparations is unlike any other people's struggle, because we are the mothers and fathers of human civilization, and we cannot do reparations in a reformist way.
I just want to thank Sister Esther and Kehinde Andrews. Give them another round of applause, please.